Hello, this is Peter Davis, and you're listening to Gallifrey Public Radio.
This is Gallifrey Public Radio, dedicated to positive enjoyment of Doctor Who. We travel through classic and new episodes, explore the extended universe, and play a few games from time to time. We do discuss news, content that has been officially released, and the occasional interesting rumor, but we'll warn you before anything considered spoilers comes up.
Welcome to episode 531 of Gallifrey Public Radio. I'm Haley.
And I'm Jay. Today we're filling our time before new content is released by taking a look at some of the older material and sharing some of the tips and tricks we've learned on our trips down the rabbit hole. Diving into the classic series can be a daunting task for anyone, especially as the catalog of new Who material just keeps growing.
But we've been at this for a while now, so we've learned a few things about preparing for the older stories and how to entice others into taking the plunge as well.
I think we've both have really dove into new Who, or into classic Who, after we were well indoctrinated in the newer stuff. I know I'd seen some of the classic stuff as a kid, but I was never really super into it. But you'd never watched any of the classic stuff before we started the podcast, right?
No. When we started covering classic material on this podcast is when I watched older Who for the first time.
So what are some of the things that you feel someone needs to know before, because we just kind of pushed you off into the deep end.
Well, I'd also been around enough Whovians that I kind of knew what I was getting myself into. But I think there's a few things you have to do to prepare somebody before throwing them into that vast ocean. I think you need to let them know when it starts, it's in black and white. It's a serialized format, which is not a storytelling format that we're used to as much as a modern audience. And then they probably know this, but just let them know, hey, it's campy and the effects are silly and hokey sometimes, but that's part of the charm. But I think you need to set the expectations at that level before you have somebody dive in.
I definitely think that knowing the production value is a major hurdle, because if you think back to the early series with Christopher Eccleston and some of the early stuff with David Tennant, even then the production quality was pretty janky, but even by today's standards.
Well, yeah, we talk about introducing people to old Who, there's a lot of old new Who now. So
yeah,
even if you're oh, where should I start? And it's if they've never watched any Who, I'm not going to have them start with 1960s classic Who. I'm going to probably say, here's a few good starting points, but even the ages of modern Who have aged. So you've got to set those expectations of okay, so the first villain is this plastic guy and his finger turns into a gun and it's kind of silly and hokey, but it's campy and charming and you're going to fall in love with it. So I think that's anytime you're introducing somebody to this, it's make sure you're calibrating their expectations.
I think also one of the things too, knowing, if you're about to do this yourself, or if you're trying to get someone into classics, know whether or not you or the person has a completionist mentality. Because one, you're not going to be able to watch everything because there's missing episodes. But you can entirely enjoy a lot of this stuff by itself. We've talked about how some of the stories are, you could give this to someone as part of a starter pack thing, or, it's not, and there's not a lot of overarching stories. So it's possible to go in and be hey, here's 4 episodes of this Doctor, here's 4 episodes of this companion, and you don't need to know a lot of the background. So don't feel you have to go back to 1963 and start there and work your way up to what you're really kind of hoping to get to. If you really want to just enjoy some Tom Baker, jump in and do it.
Right. And I think that comes down to knowing who the person is that you're introducing to the show. Start them with the part that they're going to enjoy the most. You don't have to start them at the beginning if they're going to love, this Tom Baker episode or this Sylvester McCoy story or whatever that might be. If a certain companion's going to appeal to them, find the one that's going to hook them And then they can always go backwards or forwards and enjoy things in any order because, as we've said before, a lot of this doesn't depend on knowing what comes before. Most of this, if you give them like the elevator pitch of what is Doctor Who, oh, it's this time-traveling, space-traveling alien who picks up human companions and goes on adventures. If you give them that much, the story takes them the rest of the way.
I would definitely recommend if you're trying to get someone into Doctor Who, period, where you have to use the elevator pitch, don't go classic.
Well, no.
It's we talked about how there's less distance between when the show ended or when the classic series ended in 87 and when it was revived than there is between the revival and now. So
right.
There's plenty of stuff in New Who jump in there to introduce someone to the show, but for somebody that's already into it and they want more, they want to understand the little hidden Easter eggs that the rest of us sit there bouncing on the couch. Ooh, that's when it's a good time to kind of throw somebody into Classic Who and be like, hey, try this out.
Well, and another fun way to bring them to Classic Who is as a classic villain or character is brought back in Modern Who, then be like, okay, this is where that character came from. So, for example, we just had Sutek. Then you can go back and show them this episode about Sutek from some year in the past that came out. You can do that with a lot of the villains and antagonists and protagonists that are brought forward from Classic Who. When the Zygons are introduced, that's a good chance to go back and learn about the Zygons, the Ice Warriors. If they're way into the Daleks or the Cybermen, showing them some Dalek and Cybermen stories. That's a good way to bridge that gap between classic and modern Who.
One of the things I've found that I like to do is try and pair who their New Who favorite Doctor is with someone from the classic era. Like, obviously, there's comparisons to be made between like Matt Smith and Tom Baker. They're both a little bit goofball. They're both really kind of alien, stuff. So it's fun to kind of draw those connections, be like, oh, if you really like this Doctor, try that, try and come back here to this one. David Tennant and Peter Davison is a great comparison.
Mm-hmm. Same with the companions. If there's a modern companion that they like, find the one that is most similar to that in Classic Who. Yeah.
One of the things I also enjoy doing is finding some of the stories that still resonate today and bringing those in is kind of like, there are definitely some stories that kind of echo each other where if you have the same villain, obviously that's kind of a touchstone. But a lot of tonality in things.
If they're into Bridgerton, for example, we just had the Bridgerton episode in this season of Doctor Who, but go back and find some Regency era stories that might appeal to that same interest. Right. I'm having a hard time thinking of some others. If they're into more classical stories, maybe find one set in ancient Rome or ancient Egypt. There's plenty out there in that bucket as well. Old West stories, caveman stories, whatever their thing is. Finding the thing that's going to align with their interests. That's one of the great things about Doctor Who is it spans so many interests that you can find something that lines up with it.
Yeah. There was somebody that really enjoyed the time travel aspect and they were upset that more time travel hijinks didn't happen in the show. And so I threw them at City of Death and they loved it. And they're now into, they got into that, watched a lot of Tom Baker, went back to Hartnell and started from there. And I think they're up to Davison now. So it's a great example of find something that someone is interested in, hand them that, and just watch as the obsession takes over.
I mean, maybe that's another thing to prep a viewer for as well, which if they've watched Modern Who, then they probably know this, but time travel is a vehicle to get you to the beginning of the story. Time travel very rarely affects the story once you're where the story starts. I'm sure we could probably count on one hand, maybe two, where time travel has affected the story after it started.
So what are some of the stumbling blocks that you found yourself in when you were getting started on the show or the classic series?
I guess I'll start with what was not a stumbling block. I think with properly set expectations, you can get past the effects and the black and white and the pace of the storytelling. Those things could be stumbling blocks for a modern viewer, but I think you can set the expectation so that they're not. I think some of the things that are harder to overcome with a modern viewpoint are the ideas and morals and values of the time. So you're definitely going to come across some things that from the modern audience's viewpoint, you're like, ooh, that's a little racist. That's a lot sexist. That's, you know, whatever ism you're concerned about, it's there. It's, you know, these are 60-year-old stories sometimes, and maybe they were the best thinking at the time. Maybe they were not even the best thinking at the time, but they're not going to align with the best thinking of our time.
True. Yeah. I mean, and they kind of poked fun at that in Twice Upon a Time with the 12th Doctor meeting the first Doctor being like, no, you can't say that. So yeah, that's definitely something to remember, is that these are much older episodes, and in the same vein that there are, some Looney Tunes cartoons or Tom and Jerry that we don't see anymore. There's reason for that. I know one of the things that I had to kind of try and get myself around was, you hear, because these things have been around a long time, people have formed a lot of opinions, and there's some episodes that are like touted as just absolute story, masterful storytelling, like City of Death or Caves of Androzani, which are like, they're like, oh, these great things. And similarly, there's negative opinions out there too, and don't buy into what a lot of other people say. I mean, there's great things to be found in a lot of the stories. There's great things to be found in a lot of the actors. And if you limit yourself to what someone tells you you're going to expect, you might miss out on some of the great things. I mean, I know some people who absolutely love Colin Baker, and he's their favorite classic Doctor, but there's also a lot of hate for him out there too. So if you listen to what people have to say, you might miss out on something great.
Yeah, and because we've been doing such a methodical approach, we've been watching almost everything that's actually available. There are some stories where when we get to our reviews at the end, it's like, I wouldn't recommend this. I would rewatch it while I'm folding laundry, but it wasn't great. But also while we're having the discussion, we will bring up points that was like, oh my gosh, this scene was so funny, or that thing that the Doctor did was so clever, or the companion really stood out in that one scene. Like, there are nuggets in every story that we've watched that could appeal to somebody. And you don't want to let, like, whatever the IMDb review is of that particular episode to prevent you from watching something that you may end up enjoying.
And then, I mean, the pendulum swings the other way too. Don't think that everything is going to be to your taste. Definitely find the stuff that you like, and don't let something that didn't resonate with you turn you off from watching more. There's so much content out there. It's hard to, it would be difficult to find nothing that struck your fancy. So definitely if something doesn't do it for you, move on to the next thing. Don't feel burdened by like, oh, I have to watch this entire Doctor's run so I can make it to something more interesting. It's find what you like. Yep.
New seasons tend to bring in new companions or new Doctors. So if, you're a story or two in and you're like, I'm just not feeling this, then skip ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. The start of series are great places to jump in. Like I said earlier, there's not a lot of overarching stories. So it's a great spot to kind of get an introduction to new Doctors, new companions, things like that, and see what, how it feels for you.
Yeah. Probably an important thing to bring up if we're trying to introduce new viewers is, where can they currently find classic Doctor Who?
That's the tricky part. Because obviously the new stuff is coming out on Disney Plus. Mm-hmm. The current
the
run
old new
of,
stuff.
Yeah, the new Who is on Max right now.
Mm-hmm.
And
until that license runs out, probably.
Right. I think the only place to get the classic stuff streaming without having to purchase episodes is on BritBox.
Isn't there one of like the online TV channels too that has a Doctor Who channel?
Probably.
Pluto, maybe?
I think Pluto does a lot of classic Who, but so I mean, there's
you wouldn't be able to
places...
pick your episodes, but you could watch it.
Yeah, it's gonna be very similar to like when you're like when I was growing up watching it, and you just found random episodes on PBS, and you're just like, I kind of like this show, but I don't know who these people are. It's the same kind of thing. You'll get a nice smattering. They do tend to do stories as chunks on there, but I think it can be a little scattershot as to where those stories fall into the overall scheme.
Bouncing around a little bit through time, as the Doctor intended.
Now, you had mentioned earlier, like the classic stuff was serialized, and that's not something we're super used to now. Have you played it all with actually watching one episode at a time and giving space between them?
No, and that's probably mostly because I'm usually watching it for the podcast. So I'm usually watching it all in one sitting and taking my notes and then recording the podcast. So I usually do not allow enough time to do it as an episode at a time.
I've found, because I have tried it a couple times, and sometimes I watch the first episode and I'm like, oh, that was really good. And so I immediately go on to the next one because binge watching is a thing now. But sometimes if you just take that 30-minute chunk, watch the one episode, give it space and come back to it, the things that rankle you about the first episode don't tend to carry over as much. If you're watching 2 hours of the show, then the pacing and things like that can really kind of throw you off. But if you just watch 30 minutes here and 30 minutes there and 30 minutes there, then those things really, they don't have time to pile up on you, and it doesn't really carry over. At least that's how I've felt watching it that way. So maybe try breaking it up a little.
I think I've done that maybe once in the entire run of us recording Classic Who episodes, and it does work better.
It's how it was meant to be viewed, so it kind of makes sense that it would work better that way.
And that minute and a half of overlapping content between the end of one episode and the beginning of the other is going to be a little less annoying.
Yeah, then it's not obnoxious. It actually serves a point. It's like, where were we? Oh yeah, that's what.
That's what was going on. Here we go. Because there's no last week on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just have the overlap. So, but I mean, all in all, I think that the having the desire to go back and watch some of the classic stuff really is the biggest step. If you want to take that step and watch some of the stuff, then you're already half the way there. It's the stuff that we've talked about that could be potential stepping or stumbling blocks really isn't going to bother you too much.
Yeah, I mean, if there's something already that's hooking you in or enticing you or what have you to watch the classic stories, then, we've got some time where there's not going to be new episodes. It's a great time to go back and see what's out there.
Exactly. And don't feel intimidated by the amount of stuff there is. If you're really curious about Sutek and you want to learn about that, go back and watch Sutek. And if that satiates you, don't feel like you have to watch everything just because you did start it. Feel free to dabble. That's perfectly fine. It's just something to fill the time until we get some new shooty.
Exactly. We're glad that you've taken the time to hear what we have to say about this, but we've created a new space for you to share what you think about it. We have opened up our Discord server to all of our audience, and we'd love for you to join us there. So if you check the show notes for this episode or any of our social media or our webpage, GallifreyPublicRadio.com, you'll find links to our new Discord server where you can chat with us about this podcast, Doctor Who in general, the new episodes when they come out, some other thing that you thought of and thought we should talk about too. All of that is available to be discussed at our Discord server.
This has been episode 531 of Gallifrey Public Radio. Until next time, this is Jay saying, everything old is new again. Except me. I'm just old.
And this is Haley saying, I used to not be the old one, but now I'm old too.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Gallifrey Public Radio. As a fan-run podcast, your thoughts and opinions are part of the conversation. Leave us a comment or review on your preferred podcast app, find us on social media to message us, or visit GallifreyPublicRadio.com for email and voicemail contacts. We'll see you out there in time and space.
Jacob. This recording of Gallifrey Public Radio is copyrighted in 2024. GPR is a fan-owned, fan-produced podcast. We'll see you next time!